They were made to fight gods. Now they fight anything that moves. The orcs have no empire, no plan, no fear of death, because death just makes more of them. Every world they touch becomes a battlefield that never ends. And somewhere out there, the biggest war boss in history is gathering a horde so large it could drown the galaxy in green. This is 3 hours of orc law from the war in heaven to the wars that never stop. The galaxy was not always silent. There was a time before the Imperium, before the fall, before even the eldest stars learned to fear the things that move between them. A time when gods walked the material realm and the cosmos itself was their battlefield. The war in heaven did not begin with a declaration or a betrayal. It began with the simple, inevitable mathematics of extinction. The Necronter, dying beneath their cancer sun, chose immortality over oblivion, and in choosing became the instruments of older, hungrier things. The Tan fed on stars. The old ones shaped flesh like clay. Between them, the galaxy burned. The war in heaven lasted millennia. Entire star systems were rendered into ash and memory. The warp itself convulsed under the psychic screaming of 1 billion dying races. And from that screaming, things began to coalesce in the immaterium shadows of rage and despair that would one day call themselves gods. The old ones, masters of the webway and architects of 1,000 servitor species, fought with the tools they understood best: biology, evolution, directed mutation. They seeded the galaxy with warriors bred for singular purpose. The Eldari were given grace and psychic potency. The Jokaro were given craft and silent cunning. And the Krork were given war. Not the mindless savagery of beasts, but war as science, war as culture, war as the purest expression of adaptive survival. The Krork were not accidents of evolution or the products of slow natural selection. They were weapons designed by minds so vast and alien that their very thoughts could reshape matter. Forged in gene labs beneath dying suns and birthed from spore vats the size of hive cities. They emerged fully formed into a cosmos already drowning in slaughter. And they were perfect. The first Krork stood 3 tall, their bulk encased in living armor that grew from their own flesh and fused with technological augmentation at the cellular level. Their skin was thick as tank plating, green and photosynthetic, drawing energy from any star's light and converting it into raw physical power. Their musculature was dense beyond human comprehension, woven with metallic fibers that made them stronger than any organic being had right to be. Their bones were laced with compounds harder than ceramite. Their blood a self-sealing gel that clotted in microseconds and carried oxygen with terrifying efficiency. But it was not their strength that made them weapons. It was their minds. The Krork possessed an instinctive understanding of technology that bordered on the supernatural. They knew without teaching how to forge weapons from scrap, how to coax machine spirits into obedience, how to turn rubble into fortresses and derelict ships into invasion fleets. This knowledge was genetic, burned into their very cells by the Brain Boys, the enigmatic subspecies that served as their architects and commanders. The Brain Boys were smaller, fraught with psychic potential. Their intelligence focused and surgical, where the Krork were broad and instinctual. Together, they formed a military organism of terrifying sophistication. The Krork did not fight as individuals. They fought as a gestalt. Their minds linked through a low-level psychic field that allowed instantaneous coordination across entire battlefronts. They knew where their brothers were without looking. They felt the flow of combat like a living thing, adapting in real time to enemy tactics, terrain, and circumstance. They built weapons that should not have functioned. Gravitational disruptors, molecular unravelers, singularity cannons, and through sheer collective belief, made them work. They were deployed against the Necrons in the killing fields of the galactic core. The records, what few survived, speak of battles that lasted centuries. Tomb ships translating into real space to find Krork boarding parties already waiting, having calculated their arrival point through some fusion of psychic foresight and tactical genius. Necron phalanxes advancing in perfect geometric formation, only to be torn apart by Krork heavy infantry wielding weapons that bent space-time itself. Void battles where Krork killed ships, rammed Necron tomb ships, and tore them open from within, spilling atmosphere and ancient metal into the black. The Krork did not fight with honor or restraint. They fought with totality. When they took a world, they did not occupy it. They consumed it. Spore towers erupted across captured terrain, seeding the atmosphere with microscopic fungal blooms that would gestate into new warriors, new weapons, new infrastructure. Within weeks, a barren rock could become a fortified staging ground. Within months, a hive of industry and violence. The Krork turned every battlefield into a factory for their own reproduction, a self-sustaining engine of conquest that required no supply lines, no reinforcements, no command structure beyond the gestalt will of the Wyak. But they were not mindless. The greatest Krork warlords stood as tall as imperial knights and commanded legions with strategic acumen that would have impressed the finest human generals. They understood logistics, combined arms doctrine, feints, and flanking maneuvers. They debated tactics in their guttural tongue, argued over weapon specifications, planned campaigns that spanned star systems. They were cunning, adaptive, and possessed of a terrible patience when it served their purpose. This was what terrified the Necrons most, that their enemies were not beasts, but soldiers. The Tan, those star-eating abominations wearing the flayed bodies of the Necronter, learned to recognize Krork war bands by the psychic resonance they left in the Imperium. Whole fleets would translate out of systems where Krork forces had been detected, unwilling to face an enemy that grew stronger the longer a battle lasted. The Silent King himself, in the final years before the Great Sleep, ordered the extermination protocols for any world showing signs of Krork spore infestation. Total planetary sterilization, atmospheric ignition, cyclonic bombardment until the crust itself melted. It was never enough. The spores drifted through the void, clinging to debris, hitching rides on asteroidal fragments, lying dormant in frozen comets for millennia before blooming again on distant worlds. The Krork could not be eradicated. They could only be contained, pushed back, temporarily suppressed. And even then they returned. The old ones knew what they had made. They had forged a species that was in its own way as eternal as the Necrons. Where the Necrons chose immortality through steel and soul death, the Krork chose it through spores and genetic memory. Every fallen Krork released microscopic fungi into the air, carrying within it the genetic blueprint for warriors, laborers, fungus beasts, and the strange odd boys whose specialized knowledge kept their crude civilization functioning. Death was not an ending. It was dispersal. A single Krork could in time become 1,000. The war in heaven ground toward its apocalyptic conclusion. The enslaver plague erupted from the warp, drawn by the psychic screaming of a galaxy drowning in death. The old ones, weakened and desperate, watched their empire collapse. The Necrons, horrified by what they had become, retreated into the stasis crypts of tomb worlds, choosing oblivion over continued service to the Tan. The surviving Tan were shattered, sharded, imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths by the Silent King's final gambit, and the Krork were left alone. Without the guiding intellect of the Brain Boys, without the strategic direction of the Old Ones, without enemies vast enough to demand their full potential, the Krork began to change. Not immediately, not within a single generation or even a single millennium, but slowly across the long ages, as the galaxy fell silent and the Eldari retreated into their paradise worlds, the Krork forgot. They forgot the grand strategies that had broken Necron dynasties. They forgot the technological principles that had let them build weapons of apocalyptic precision. They forgot the discipline that had made them soldiers instead of savages. But they did not forget war. War was burned too deeply into their genetic code to ever be erased. It was the fundamental pillar of their existence, the axis around which their entire biology revolved. Without enemies, they fought each other. War bands splintered into tribes, tribes fractured into clans. The great Krork warlords died, and their successors were smaller, cruder, less intelligent. The psychic gestalt that had once coordinated armies across star systems became fragmented, localized, tribal. The brain boys vanished, either exterminated in internal conflicts or simply dying out as their purpose became obsolete. The massive gene forges and spore factories fell silent, overgrown with wild fungal blooms, their secrets lost. The Krork's living armor degraded into cruder forms, scavenged and cobbled together from scrap rather than grown from bioengineered templates. Their weapons became simpler, more brutal, less elegant. They became orcs, not in a single moment of transformation, but through the slow erosion of millions of years. The process was so gradual that no single generation could perceive it, yet inexorable as continental drift. The towering 3M warriors became 2M brutes. The sophisticated weapon systems became brutal slug throwers and chain axes. The strategic genius became simple animal cunning. But some things remained. The spores still carried genetic memory, still encoded the knowledge of mech boys and pain boys and weird boys within their cellular structure. The psychic field still bound them together, weaker now, but present, a ghost of the old gestalt. The instinctive understanding of technology persisted, degraded into something more superstitious, but no less effective. An orc could still look at a pile of scrap and see a weapon, could still build machines that violated every law of physics and make them function through sheer belief. And they still grew stronger through violence. This was the terrible gift the old ones had given them, a biology that used combat itself as evolutionary pressure. An orc that survived a fight grew larger, tougher, more cunning. An orc that killed 100 enemies became a leader. An orc that conquered a world became a war boss. The mechanism was psychic as much as physical. The Wyack, energy flowing through the gestalt field and empowering those who proved themselves in battle. They were a species designed to thrive in perpetual war. And when the war in heaven ended, they did not stop fighting. They could not stop. It would have been like asking them to stop breathing. The spores drifted. They landed on feral worlds where primitive human tribes still cowered in caves. And within decades, those worlds became orc strongholds. The humans extinct or enslaved. They took root in the ruins of Eldari maiden worlds, blooming in the ashes of civilizations that had fallen to she who thirsts. They germinated in asteroid fields and space hulks, creating void orc clans that raided shipping lanes and built ramshackle fleets from captured vessels. Everywhere the spores touched, war followed. Not the calculated strategic warfare of the ancient Krork, but something raw and more fundamental, tribal, instinctive, joyful. The orcs fought because fighting was what they were made for. And, in fighting, they found something that might have been happiness. They did not agonize over their purpose or question their existence. They knew with absolute certainty that they were meant to fight, to conquer, to prove themselves stronger than anything else in the galaxy. It was a terrible, beautiful simplicity. The Eldari, ascending to their peak in the ages before the fall, encountered orc raiders on their frontier worlds and recoiled in disgust. These crude, violent things were a mockery of what the Krork had been devolved, barbaric, barely sentient. The Eldari cleansed worlds of orc infestation with controlled singularities and planet-killing psychic rituals, scoured them down to bedrock, and then deeper still, ensuring no spore survived. And still they returned. Because a single spore could drift for centuries in the void, could survive temperatures near absolute zero, and radiation that would sterilize most worlds could lie dormant until conditions became favorable, and then bloom into an entire ecosystem. The orcs were not an empire that could be defeated by destroying its infrastructure or killing its leaders. They were a plague, self-replicating and unkillable, written into the galaxy's genetic code by hands that no longer existed. The Imperium of man, when it finally rose from the ashes of old night, discovered this truth the hard way. The Great Crusade encountered orc worlds in every segmentum. Some were primitive, barely above Stone Age savagery, tribes fighting with clubs and crude firearms. Others were industrialized hellscapes, where massive gargants strode across landscapes of rust and fire. where orc mech boys built attack ships from scavenged Imperial hulls and sent them screaming into the void on pillars of flame that should have melted their engines, but somehow, impossibly, did not. The Astartes legions purged these worlds with bolter and flame, virus bombs, and orbital bombardment. They killed billions of greenskins, razed their settlements to ash, sterilized the ground with controlled plasma burns, and within a century, the orcs returned, sprouting from spores that had survived in deep caverns or been carried to neighboring systems on the hulls of fleeing ships. The Imperium learned what the Eldari had known for millennia. You cannot kill the orcs. You can only fight them endlessly, eternally, until the stars themselves burn out. But the Imperium did not yet understand how much worse it could become. They did not understand that the orcs were not fixed in their degeneration, that under the right circumstances, they could grow, could evolve, could remember what they had been. The spores carried memory, deep in their genetic structure, buried beneath millions of years of degradation. The blueprint for the Krork still existed. And when enough orcs gathered in one place, when a Waak grew large enough and the psychic field became strong enough, when a war boss proved himself against the greatest enemies the galaxy could offer, something ancient began to stir. The orcs began to grow, not in the scattered, uncoordinated fashion of individual war bosses becoming larger through personal combat, but systematically entire generations growing taller, stronger, smarter, technology becoming more sophisticated, tactics becoming more refined, the psychic gestalt tightening, coordinating, planning, the dormant legacy of the Krork. Waiting for the galaxy to provide enough war to wake it fully. The spores drifted through the void, patient as entropy, carrying within them the memory of the war in heaven and the promise of wars yet to come. They landed on dead worlds and jungle planets, frozen moons and burning deserts, space hulks and asteroid colonies. Wherever they landed, they took root, and the galaxy, already drowning in endless conflict, fed them. The orcs did not mourn what they had lost. They could not conceive of mourning. They fought, and in fighting they were content. They built crude empires that collapsed into infighting spawned legendary war bosses who united tribes for brief glorious wars before dying and seeing their legions fragment again. They raided and conquered and laughed in the face of death because death meant nothing to a species that reproduced through spores. They were the galaxy's eternal constant. Empires rose and fell. Species went extinct. Stars burned out and new ones ignited. And through it all, the orcs endured, crude and violent and unkillable. A green tide that could never be stemmed, only temporarily diverted. The old ones were gone, their empire dust, their works forgotten. The Tan were shattered, imprisoned in cosmic cages. The Necrons slept in their tomb worlds, waiting for a galaxy to reconquer. The Eldari built their paradise and dreamed of immortality. And the orcs fought. They fought because it was all they knew, all they needed to know. The universe was a battlefield. And they were the battlefield's children, born from spores in the ashes of the war in heaven, shaped by hands that had meant to create the perfect weapon and had succeeded beyond their darkest imagination. The Krork were gone, but the orcs remained. And in the grim darkness of the far future, as the galaxy tore itself apart in wars beyond counting, as the Imperium crumbled and the Great Rift split reality itself, as ancient enemies stirred and new horrors emerged from the void, the spores drifted still, landing, taking root, blooming, ready. The age of strife was not named for its brevity. For 5,000 years, humanity tore itself apart in the darkness between stars. Its colonies isolated by warp storms and madness. Its civilization collapsing into techno-barbarism and worse. The Eldari, drunk on their own decadence, danced toward oblivion in pleasure cults that would birth a god of excess and drown their empire in a single psychic scream. The galaxy, already scarred by the war in heaven, learned new definitions of suffering. And in that suffering, the orcs thrived. The spores had been drifting for millennia, patient as cosmic radiation, settling on worlds that humanity had colonized during the dark age of technology, and then abandoned when the warp became impossible. They germinated in the ruins of terraforming stations, in crashed colony ships, in the basements of hive cities where desperate survivors huddled against the dying of the light. They bloomed in jungles that had reclaimed plasteel and rockcrete, in deserts where sand buried the bones of civilizations, in frozen wastes where ice preserved the corpses of machines that had once touched the stars. Wherever humans had been, the spores followed. The first orcs to emerge were small, barely larger than the Gretchen that scuttled at their feet. They fought with stones and sharpened metal, hunting the local fauna and each other with equal enthusiasm. But they grew. Every conflict, every kill, every moment of violence fed the psychic gestalt that bound them, and the gestalt fed back strength and size and cunning. Within a generation, war bosses emerged, crude and brutal, but large enough to unite the squabbling mobs through sheer physical dominance. The humans who remained on these worlds learned to fear the greenskins. They built walls that the orcs smashed through. They organized militias that the orcs overwhelmed with numbers and raw ferocity. They prayed to the emperor, that distant figure half remembered through oral tradition, and received only silence. The orcs did not pray. They fought, and their fighting was its own religion, its own purpose, its own reward. The biology of the orcs was a cruel masterpiece of efficiency. They did not need to eat, though they could and did when food was available, stuffing their gullets with anything organic and some things that were not. Their photosynthetic skin drew energy from light, any light, converting it into chemical fuel that powered their massive frames. They could survive for weeks without water, their bodies retaining moisture with the efficiency of desert plants. Radiation that would kill humans in hours merely made them sick, and they recovered quickly, their cells mutating to adapt and overcome. But it was their reproductive cycle that made them truly nightmarish. Every orc was infested with microscopic fungal organisms that lived in symbiosis with their flesh. When an orc died, these fungi bloomed, releasing clouds of spores into the air and soil. Some spores grew into snotlings, tiny creatures barely intelligent enough to perform basic labor. Others became Gretchen or Grots, small and cowardly, but cunning enough to operate simple machinery and serve as menial workers. And some, the largest and most vital spores, became orcs themselves. The entire ecosystem was self-contained and self-replicating. An orc killed on a battlefield released spores that would within weeks produce snotlings that fed on local vegetation and their own waste. The snotlings cultivated fungal gardens that produced squigs, bizarre ambulatory mushrooms with snapping jaws that served as livestock, attack beasts, and emergency rations. The squigs fed the Gretchen. The Gretchen tended the gardens and constructed crude shelters. And from the richest, most fertile patches of spore loam, new orcs emerged, already possessing instinctive knowledge of violence and hierarchy. No orc was born helpless. They clawed their way from the ground, already knowing how to fight, how to recognize stronger orcs and defer to them, how to build weapons from scrap. This knowledge was genetic memory burned into their spores by the ancient Krork architects, who had designed them to be self-sufficient soldiers. The degradation of millions of years had made this knowledge cruder, more instinctive than intellectual, but it remained functional, and some orcs were born different. The odd boys emerged from spores that carried specialized genetic templates. Mech boys possessed an intuitive understanding of technology, able to look at broken machinery and know, without formal education or blueprints, how to repair it, improve it, cobble it together with other salvage into something that should not work, but somehow did. Pain boys understood orc physiology with the same instinctive clarity, performing surgeries with rusted tools and no anesthetic, transplanting limbs and organs, augmenting their patients with mechanical replacements that fused directly to green flesh. Weird boys were perhaps the strangest of all. They were born more psychically sensitive than their kin, able to feel the whack, energy that flowed through every orc gathering like an invisible current. This was both gift and curse. The psychic pressure of nearby orcs built in their skulls like steam in a seal chamber, causing migraines, hallucinations, and eventually explosive releases of raw warp energy that could immolate enemies, or if the weird boy was unlucky, himself. They were pariahs and weapons kept at arm's length by other orcs, but valued for the destruction they could unleash when aimed at the enemy. Together, these odd boys preserved fragments of the Krork legacy. A mech boy did not understand why his inventions worked, could not explain the principles of physics or engineering that govern them. He simply knew that if you bolted this gun to that engine and painted it red, it would go faster. And because he believed it would go faster, because every orc who saw it believed it would go faster, the psychic gestalt made it true. Their technology was as much faith as science. Belief made manifest through the Wyak field that connected every greenskin mind. This was how orc vehicles functioned despite violating every principle of thermodynamics. This was how their guns fired with reasonable accuracy, despite having no rifling, no standardized ammunition, sometimes no proper barrel at all. This was how their ships crossed the void without Geller fields. The orcs' simple conviction that they would reach their destination, protecting them from the horrors of the warp through sheer ignorant confidence. The Imperium's Mechanicus would spend centuries studying captured orc technology, trying to understand how it functioned, only to discover that when operated by human hands, it did not. The weapons jammed, the engine seized, the force fields failed. The technology required orcs to function, required their psychic field to bridge the gap between crude construction and actual effectiveness. It was maddening. It was impossible. It was utterly, terrifyingly real. The scattered orc populations of the Age of Strife began to coalesce into something resembling civilization. On feral worlds, war bosses united tribes into larger confederations, building settlements around crude fortresses where mech boys forged weapons, and pain boys patched up wounded warriors between raids. These settlements were chaotic, filthy places where violence was the primary form of social interaction, and property rights were determined by who could hit harder. But they functioned after a fashion held together by the simple hierarchy of strength and the shared joy of impending violence. The culture that emerged was savage, but not without structure. Orcs organized themselves into clans, each with its own identity and preferred method of warfare. The Goths were brutal close combat specialists who disdained ranged weapons as cowardly. The Bad Moons were wealthy by orc standards, their teeth growing faster than other clans, and thus providing more currency in the orc economy, where teeth were literally money. The Evil Sons were speed fanatics who painted everything red and drove vehicles at suicidal velocities. The Death Skulls were looters and scavengers who believed that blue paint brought luck and stole anything not nailed down and many things that were. Other clans emerged and faded across different worlds. The Blood Axes who studied enemy tactics and were considered vaguely treasonous for their willingness to use camouflage and retreat. The Snakebites who rejected excessive technology and preferred to fight with traditional weapons and war beasts. The Freebooters who took to the void as pirates and raiders, answering to no war boss but their own captain. The clan system was not rigid. An orc could change clans if he adopted their methods and proved himself to their bosses. But most orcs felt a deep instinctive loyalty to the clan of their emergence. A tribal identity burned into their spores and reinforced through shared culture. And above all clans stood the twin gods, Gork and Mork. The orcs worshipped these deities with the same instinctive certainty that guided their technology. Gork was cunningly brutal. Mork was brutally cunning. The distinction was important to orcs, though no two agreed on which god embodied which trait, and arguments over this theological minutiae often devolved into enthusiastic brawls. Weird boys claimed to hear the gods' voices in the roar of the Wyak, and great war bosses declared themselves prophets of the divine will. Whether Gork and Mork truly existed as entities in the warp, or whether they were simply manifestations of the collective orc psyche given form and power by the Gestalt field, was a question human scholars debated endlessly. The orcs did not care. They knew their gods were real because they felt them in their bones, heard them in the thunder of massed feet marching to war, saw them in the glorious carnage of battle. Faith and reality were the same to the orcs, indistinguishable and inseparable. The first great orc empires emerged on backwater worlds, far from the collapsing centers of galactic civilization. War bosses who proved themselves in battle against human survivors, native predators, and rival orc clans grew large and cunning. Some reached heights of 3M, their muscles swollen with whack energy, their minds sharpening from crude animal cunning into something approaching tactical intelligence. These big bosses united multiple mobs under their rule, then multiple tribes, then entire continents. They built fortresses of scrap metal and rockcrete, forges that belched black smoke into toxic skies, shipyards where captured human vessels were torn apart and rebuilt according to orc logic. These proto-empires were unstable, held together entirely by the war boss' personal strength and charisma. When a war boss grew old or weak, rivals challenged him. If he fell, his empire fractured instantly, his mob splitting off to follow new leaders or simply returning to tribal warfare. There was no succession, no institutional memory, no bureaucracy to maintain order. The orcs had no word for administration, and would have found the concept hilarious if they could understand it. Leadership was proven through violence, and when a leader could no longer fight, he had no right to lead. This constant cycle of consolidation and collapse defined orc civilization. A war boss would spend decades uniting the clans, building a whack that threatened entire star systems, leading his boys to glorious victories against overwhelming odds. And then he would die, shot by an enemy sniper or betrayed by an ambitious subordinate or simply worn down by age and accumulated wounds. His empire would dissolve like spores in a stiff wind, his name forgotten within a generation, his conquests meaningless except as setup for the next war boss to begin the cycle anew. The Eldari watched this pattern repeat across centuries and felt something close to despair. The craft world Eldari, those who had escaped the fall by fleeing onto massive world ships before She Who Thirst was born, encountered orc raiders on the fringes of the webway. The greenskins attacked Exodite worlds, those agrarian Eldari who had rejected the decadence of the Empire and now lived simple lives on maiden planets. The orcs did not understand the elegance they were destroying, the millennia of careful stewardship and cultural refinement. They saw targets, resources, good fights. The Eldari fought back with weapons that could unmake matter at the molecular level, with psychic powers that could boil the thoughts inside an orc skull, with strategic cunning honed over millions of years of civilization. And they won time and again, killing the orcs down to the last spore carrier, sterilizing the ground with psychic fire, sealing the planet behind Wewey portals that only Eldari could navigate. And within decades, the orcs returned, because they had missed a spore or because raiders from a neighboring system had heard there was a good fight on that world and came to join in, or because an orc ship had crashed in the outer system centuries ago, and its spores had finally drifted down to the planet's surface. The how did not matter. The orcs always returned. The Eldari began to understand the cruel joke the Old Ones had played on the galaxy. They had created a species that could not be eradicated, that thrived on the one constant the universe provided in endless supply, violence. Every attempt to destroy them fed them. Every war made them stronger. Every Pyrrhic victory was a delayed defeat because the spores would bloom again and the cycle would continue. The orcs were the ultimate revenge of the Old Ones against a cosmos that had killed them. A final curse written in genetic code and set loose to multiply forever. The Great Crusade, when it finally erupted from Terra in the 30th millennium, encountered orcs on every front. The Emperor's expeditionary fleets translated into system after system and found them infested with greenskins. Some worlds were primitive, the orcs barely above Stone Age savagery, easily crushed by Imperial Guard regiments and Astartes strike forces. Others were industrialized nightmares, where orc technology had somehow impossibly reached a level of sophistication that rivaled human engineering. Battle moons orbited conquered worlds. Gargants the size of Imperator Titans strode across wastelands of rust and fire. Orc Waifs, numbering in the billions, prepared to launch themselves at the Imperium, only barely beaten back by the combined might of multiple space marine legions. The Emperor recognized what he faced. He had lived through Old Night, had seen the orcs spread like plague during humanity's darkest hours. He knew they could not be reasoned with, could not be integrated into his vision of unified humanity, could not be ignored. They had to be fought constantly and without mercy, or they would drown humanity in a green tide. The Imperium learned to fight the orcs as an ongoing process rather than a solvable problem. Compliance fleets were assigned to orc-held systems, with orders not just to conquer, but to sterilize. Worlds were virus-bombed. Their atmospheres ignited. Their crusts melted to glass. Entire planets were declared purdah and quarantined too, infested to save. Left to the orcs in the hope that they would fight themselves to extinction in isolation. It never worked. The orcs did fight each other gleefully and constantly, but extinction was not a concept that applied to them. The spores drifted. They clung to the hulls of Imperial ships dormant in the void, traveling light years before falling off during repairs or combat. They survived in cargo holds, in air filtration systems, in the boots of soldiers who had walked through battlefields where orcs had died. A single spore reaching an agri-world could within a century turn it into an orc stronghold. The Imperium instituted quarantine procedures, genetic screenings, atmospheric purges. None of it was enough. The orcs were eternal because they were simple. They did not need infrastructure or supply lines. They did not require propaganda or ideology to motivate them. They did not suffer from political infighting or economic collapse. They fought because fighting was their nature. And, in fighting, they found all the meaning they required. Every setback was temporary. Every defeat was an opportunity to try again. Every dead orc became the seeds of future warriors. The galaxy learned to live with them as one lives with a chronic illness. Managing symptoms, treating outbreaks, knowing that cure was impossible and remission was the best one could hope for. And in the darkness between stars, on forgotten worlds and drifting hulks, on planets that had never known human touch, and moons that orbited dying stars, the spores continued to bloom. They emerged from the ground, already knowing their purpose. Already hungry for war, already perfect, the Imperium thought it had won. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, neither living nor dead, his broken body sustained by technologies that consumed 1,000 psychers daily just to keep his corpse breathing. The Horus heresy was over. The traitor legions banished to the Eye of Terror. The galaxy bathed in blood, but ostensibly pacified. The High Lords of Terra, those bureaucrats and generals who now ruled in the Emperor's stead, turned their attention to rebuilding what the Civil War had shattered. They did not see the green tide gathering in the galactic east. The War of the Beast began without declaration or warning in the 1st century of the 32nd millennium. Orc forces erupted from the Ullanor sector, that region which the Emperor himself had once cleansed during the Great Crusade, where he had elevated Horus to War Master and declared humanity's greatest triumph over the green-skinned menace. The symbolism was not lost on those who understood such things. The orcs were returning to the site of their greatest defeat, and this time they were different. They were larger. The first reports from Frontier World spoke of orcs standing 3 m tall, larger than any greenskin encountered during the Crusade. Imperial commanders dismissed these accounts as exaggeration. The panicked observations of undertrained PDF forces facing their first Xenos incursion. Then entire regiments went silent. Then entire systems. Then the picked captures arrived. Grainy and corrupted by atmospheric interference, but clear enough to show the truth. The orcs had evolved. These were not the crude savages the Imperium had grown accustomed to fighting. They wore armor that was not scavenged scrap, but purpose-built plate, articulated and reinforced, bearing glyphs that suggested organization beyond tribal mob rule. Their weapons were still brutal, still covered in spikes and tribal markings, but they functioned with disturbing reliability. Their ships translated from the warp in coordinated fleet formations rather than scattered raiding parties, and they could speak Gothic. This was perhaps the most horrifying revelation. When Imperial delegations were sent to negotiate planetary evacuations or prisoner exchanges, they encountered orc ambassadors who stood in Barak halls and communicated in human language. The pronunciation was guttural, the grammar simplified, but the meaning was clear. The orcs understood diplomacy well enough to use it as a weapon, to stall for time while their forces maneuvered, to sow confusion in Imperial command structures unused to enemies who negotiated. The orcs were not supposed to negotiate. They were supposed to attack, to fight, to die gloriously in senseless charges against superior firepower. This new behavior suggested intelligence, planning, patience. It suggested something far closer to the ancient Krork than anyone in the Imperium wanted to acknowledge. The orc invasion was led by 6 war bosses, each commanding forces that numbered in the billions. They were called the Prime Orcs, though this designation came from Imperial xenobiologists trying to categorize what they witnessed, rather than from the orcs themselves. Each stood taller than an Astartes in full armor. Their musculature, so dense that even bolter rounds sometimes failed to penetrate deep enough to reach vital organs. Their skin was darker than normal orcs, a deep forest green rather than the typical lighter shade, and their eyes held a cunning that made veteran commanders deeply uncomfortable. These were not beasts. These were generals. The 6 war bosses operated with coordination that defied everything the Imperium understood about orc behavior. They divided their forces according to strategic necessity rather than clan affiliation. They established supply lines and fortified positions. They retreated when battles turned against them, preserving their forces for future engagements rather than fighting to the last with typical orc stubbornness. They employed feints and flanking maneuvers and timed their assaults to exploit Imperial weaknesses. They fought like the Astartes legions had fought during the Great Crusade, and this was intolerable. The Imperium's response was hampered by the wounds it still nursed from the heresy. The Space Marine legions had been broken apart in Guilliman's reformations, split into chapters of 1,000 warriors each to prevent any single commander from wielding the kind of power Horus had abused. This meant that where once a legion of 10,000 Astartes could be deployed as a unified force, now such strength required coordination between 10 different chapters, each with its own command structure, traditions, and strategic priorities. The process of mustering such forces took months. The orcs did not give them months. World after world fell to the greenskin advance. The orcs did not simply conquer, they transformed. On captured planets, massive spore towers erupted within weeks. Structures hundreds of meters tall that belched clouds of fungal matter into the atmosphere. These towers were built with disturbing architectural sophistication, their design suggesting knowledge of structural engineering that went far beyond crude orc construction. Around them, entire industrial complexes took shape. Factories and forges that produced war material at rates that matched Imperial manufacturums. And then there were the attack moons. The first one appeared in orbit over the shrine world of Ardemantua, a celestial body roughly the size of Terra's moon, but clearly artificial. Its surface was covered in weapon batteries, shield generators, and docking facilities for orc fleet elements. When the Imperial Navy engaged it, expecting to exploit the orcs' typical lack of void combat coordination, they discovered that the attack moon could translate through the warp. It vanished from Ardemantua's orbit and reappeared over Terra, the home world of humanity, the cradle of the Imperium, the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy, suddenly found itself under siege by an orc superweapon that had bypassed every defensive cordon and emerged directly in the Sol system. The symbolic horror of this could not be overstated. Terra, which had not faced external threats since the heresy, was under attack by Xeno's filth. The attack moon hung in orbit like a green tumor, and from it poured landing craft and drop pods carrying orc invasion forces. The defense of Terra lasted months. The Imperial Fists, successors to Rogel Dorn's Legion and guardians of the Imperial Palace, threw themselves into the defense with desperate fury. They fought the orcs in the outer hive levels, in the sprawling industrial sectors, in the ruins of ancient cities that predated the Imperium itself. The Greenskins showed none of the disorganization typical of orc invasions. They advanced methodically, securing territory before moving forward, establishing kill zones and fortified positions. The High Lords watched their world burn and finally understood the magnitude of the threat. This was not a war in the traditional sense. This was an invasion planned with strategic acumen, executed with military precision, aimed at the symbolic and practical heart of imperial power. If Terra fell, if the Emperor's throne world was conquered by orcs, the psychological damage to humanity would be incalculable. Every imperial citizen in the galaxy would know that even the most sacred ground could not stand against the green tide. The Imperium mobilized everything it had. Space Marine chapters from across the galaxy received emergency summons. The Black Templars, newly founded in the aftermath of the heresy, led the counter-offensive with Crusader zeal. The Imperial Navy assembled the largest fleet concentration since the heresy itself. Thousands of warships translating into the Sol system to engage the Orc Armada. Titan legions strode into battle. God machines the size of Hab blocks trading fire with Orc gargants that matched them in size and exceeded them in raw brutality. The fighting was apocalyptic. Entire hive cities were reduced to rubble in the crossfire. Plasma weapons scorched the earth to glass. Void shields flickered and failed under sustained bombardment, exposing the warriors beneath to weapons that could unmake flesh and steel with equal efficiency. The orcs fought with their typical ferocity, but now that ferocity was tempered by tactical intelligence. They fell back when pressed, regrouped, counterattacked from unexpected angles. The attack moon itself proved nearly indestructible. Its void shields absorbed fire from entire Navy battle groups. Its weapon batteries could engage targets in orbit and on the surface simultaneously. Boarding actions by Astartes strike forces penetrated its outer halls, only to become mired in brutal close quarters combat against Orc defenders, who had turned the moon's interior into a labyrinth of kill zones and ambush points. The Greenskins had learned from fighting Astartes, had adapted their tactics to counter transhuman warriors bred for close combat supremacy. This was what made the Beast War so terrifying. The orcs were learning not in the slow evolutionary sense of species adaptation, but rapidly tactically incorporating lessons from each engagement into their next battle plan. This suggested command structures capable of processing information and disseminating new tactics across entire armies. It suggested the kind of Gestalt intelligence that the ancient Krork had possessed, that neural network of psychic connection that allowed instant coordination across battlefronts. The Imperium was fighting an echo of the war in heaven, and it was losing. Other attack moons appeared over other worlds. One besieged the Forge world of Agrippina, threatening to sever the Mechanicus production capabilities. Another materialized in the Segmentum Pacificus, drawing naval forces away from the defense of Terra. The orcs were not mindlessly throwing themselves at humanity's strongholds. They were conducting a multi-pronged strategic campaign designed to fracture imperial response and exploit the Imperium's inability to coordinate across such vast distances. Months became years. The war ground on. The orcs employed weapons that defied imperial understanding. Gravitational disruptors that could crumple starships like paper. Teleportation technology that allowed entire mobs to materialize behind enemy lines without the risks of warp travel. Force fields that bent light and matter around them, making fortifications nearly impossible to target effectively. The Mechanicus studied captured orc technology in desperate hope of understanding it, only to find that it should not function at all. The weapons were crude by imperial standards, their construction often laughable, their tolerances absurd, and yet they worked. A gun with a barrel that was visibly misaligned still fired accurately. An engine that should have seized from thermal stress ran smoothly. A force field generator built from scrap and wired together with no apparent understanding of physics still projected a stable protective bubble. The answer when the Mechanicus finally accepted it was psychic. The orcs' collective belief channeled through the WAAC. Gestalt field made their technology functional. They believed a red vehicle would go faster, and so it did. They believed a gun would shoot, and so it shot. The physical construction was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the psychic energy of billions of orcs, all convinced that their weapons worked. This was not reproducible, not something the Imperium could study or adopt. It was unique to the orcs, a function of their bizarre biology and gestalt consciousness. It was also profoundly dangerous when focused through prime orcs who could direct that belief with strategic intelligence. The turning point came when the Black Templars launched their desperate assault on the last remaining attack moon. High Marshal Bohemond, leading elements from multiple chapters in what would later be called the First Black Crusade, though this term would be repurposed for darker purposes in later millennia, coordinated a simultaneous strike on the attack moon's critical systems. Astartes' forces boarded from multiple vectors, supported by Navy fire that exhausted ammunition stores to keep the Orc defenders occupied. The fighting in the moon's corridors was among the most brutal of the entire war. The Orcs defending the moon were larger than any previously encountered, some approaching 4 m in height. They wore powered armor that seemed to fuse organic and mechanical elements, muscle and metal working in concert. They fought with weapons that could punch through ceramite and fought with a discipline that made them seem more like Astartes than greenskins. Every corridor was contested. Every chamber was paid for in blood. But the Astartes persevered through sheer will and genetic superiority. They reached the moon's core, a vast chamber where the psychic machinery that allowed warp translation was housed. What they found there defied immediate understanding. A massive organic mechanical construct that pulsed with Wyack. Energy tended by Orc weird boys who channeled the Gestalt field through crystalline structures that should not have existed. The technology was sophisticated beyond anything the Imperium had attributed to Orcs, suggesting knowledge that had been preserved from the ancient Krork era. The Astartes destroyed it with melta-charges and holy fury. The attack moon shuddered, its systems failing in cascading sequence. Without the core, it could not translate, could not sustain its shields, could not coordinate its weapon batteries. The Imperial Navy, seeing their opportunity, unleashed cyclonic torpedoes and nova cannons, bombardment that would crack a planet's crust. The attack moon broke apart in expanding clouds of debris and atmosphere, thousands of Orcs venting into the void. With the moon's destruction, the Orc offensive collapsed. Not immediately, not cleanly, but perceptibly. The coordinated attacks became sporadic. The tactical sophistication degraded into familiar Orc brutality. The green-skinned forces began fighting among themselves as much as the Imperium. War bosses turning on each other in disputes over leadership. Now that the prime Orcs who had united them were dead or scattered, the Imperium drove them back. System by system, world by world, purging the Orc infestation with fire and fury. It took decades to fully cleanse the territories the beast had conquered. Some worlds were declared exterminatus, too thoroughly corrupted by Orc spores to ever be safely reclaimed. Others were retaken at terrible cost, their populations decimated, their infrastructure destroyed, their very soil seeded with greenskin spores that would bloom for centuries to come. The Imperium had won, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Terra itself bore scars that would never fully heal. Entire hive sectors had been reduced to rubble. Millions had died in the fighting. The psychological impact of seeing the Emperor's homeworld besieged by Xenos was a wound to imperial pride that would fester for millennia. And the High Lords understood with cold certainty that it could happen again. The beast had demonstrated that Orcs could evolve beyond their typical savagery. That under the right conditions, they could remember what the Krork had been. The genetic potential was there dormant, but present, waiting for enough war and enough Wyack energy to awaken it. The Imperium could not allow such conditions to develop. Orc populations had to be suppressed constantly, prevented from ever gathering in sufficient numbers to trigger that evolutionary regression toward their original form. This became Imperial doctrine, eternal vigilance against the green tide. New organizations were established to monitor Orc activity across the galaxy. Death Watch kill teams specialized in rapid response to greenskin outbreaks. Entire crusades were dedicated to scouring systems clean before Orc populations could reach critical mass. The Imperium threw uncountable lives and resources at a problem that had no solution, only management. The spores drifted still, patient, and unkillable, carrying within them the memory of the beast. The orcs themselves did not mourn their defeat or learn from their failure. They could not conceive of such things. They fought, and in fighting found joy. And when they died, they became spores that would fight again. The Beast War was just another battle in an eternal campaign, a particularly good scrap that the Imperium had barely survived. And in the dark places between stars, in forgotten systems and unexplored regions, other orcs grew large and cunning, dreaming dreams of war and conquest, waiting for their time to rise and test themselves against the galaxy's mightiest warriors. The cycle continued, eternal, inevitable, green. The galaxy learned to recognize the signs. First came the silence, the sudden cessation of communication from frontier worlds. Vox channels going dead mid-transmission with only static remaining. Then the refugees, ragged survivors fleeing in system ships and cargo haulers, their eyes wide with the particular terror that came from witnessing overwhelming violence. They spoke of green tides, of crude ships blotting out the stars, of laughter like thunder rolling across battlefields stained with blood and oil. And then, inevitably, the greenskins themselves arrived, and the killing began in earnest. These were the Waifs, the great migrations of orckind, and they defined the rhythm of galactic warfare for 10,000 years. A Waif did not begin with planning or logistics or strategic consideration. It began with a feeling, a psychic pressure building in the Gestalt field that connected all orcs across light years of void. Some war boss, larger and more cunning than his rivals, would feel the call of Gork and Mork burning in his skull like a brand. He would know with absolute genetic certainty that it was time to gather the clans and wage war on a scale that would make the gods themselves take notice. The war boss would crush his rivals or absorb them, his reputation drawing orcs from across entire sectors. They came in ramshackle ships and cobbled together transports pouring into his system like iron filings drawn to a lodestone. They came because the Wayak called to them, because the psychic resonance of billions of orcs thinking the same violent thoughts created a gravitational pull in the Imperium that was impossible to resist. They came because staying behind meant missing the greatest fight of the age. And for an orc, missing a good fight was a fate worse than death. The war boss grew with every arrival, fed by the Wayak, energy of his burgeoning horde. An orc who had been 2 m tall swelled to 3. His muscles thickened, his bones lengthened. His jaw jutted forward to accommodate tusks that grew like daggers from his lower mandible. His skin darkened from light green to forest shade to nearly black in the largest specimens. His mind sharpened, animal cunning, evolving into something approximating tactical intelligence. Not human intelligence, never that, but a brutal pragmatism that understood how to break enemies and when to apply overwhelming force. This was the terror of the Wayak. It made orcs more than they had been. The Charidon Orc Empire had festered for centuries in the galactic east, a sprawling domain of conquered worlds where greenskins bred in uncountable numbers. Its overlord, arch-arsonist of Charidon, commanded resources that rivaled imperial sector governors, fleets that blackened entire star systems, gargants that walked on legs the size of high spires. His realm was a nightmare of industrial smoke and constant warfare. Orcs fighting each other when no external enemies presented themselves. The entire society sustained by violence as both economy and entertainment. The Charidon campaigns drew imperial attention for generations. Crusades launched and broken against green tides that simply absorbed losses and returned stronger. The Imperium learned that fighting orcs in their strongholds was like fighting the ocean. Each wave pushed back only to be replaced by another. The source inexhaustible. But Charidon was merely one empire among many, and not even the greatest. In the galactic south, Octarius became a killing field beyond comprehension. When Hive Fleet Leviathan crashed into Orc-held space, the Inquisition had deliberately guided the Tyranids toward this region, hoping the 2 xeno-species would annihilate each other and solve 2 problems simultaneously. Instead, they created a third problem larger than either component, an evolutionary pressure cooker, where orcs fought Tyranids in battles that lasted decades. Both species adapting and growing stronger through constant bloodshed. The orcs thrived in this environment. They grew larger, more vicious, more cunning. The Tyranids consumed orc biomass and incorporated their adaptive genetics, creating hybrid organisms of terrifying capability. The war spread outward from Octarius like a cancer, threatening to engulf neighboring systems in a green and purple tide of hyper-evolved killers. The Imperium watched in horror and tried desperately to contain the contamination zone, knowing that failure meant unleashing something worse than either species alone. But among all the war bosses and all the Waifs of the 41st Millennium, one name rose above the rest: Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka. His origin was unremarkable. A low-ranking orc of the Goth clan, a warrior among billions, distinguished only by his enthusiasm for violence and his tendency to charge headlong into the thickest fighting. He would have lived and died as just another greenskin, his spores blooming on whatever world claimed his corpse, his name forgotten within days of his death. But during a battle against human forces on the world of Urk, a bolter round struck him in the skull. The wound should have killed him. Instead, he woke on a painboy's operating table, his cranium cracked open, his brain exposed to the smoke-filled air of the surgery. The painboy, a sawbones named Mad Doke Grotznik, who was legendarily insane even by orc standards, installed a crude adamantium plate to cover the hole, along with various augment bits he had lying around. The surgery was performed without anesthetic, with rusty tools, in conditions that would horrify any Imperial medici. Gazkul survived, and when he woke, he had changed. He claimed to hear the voices of Gork and Mork speaking directly into his mind, their words transmitted through the metal plate in his skull like a Vox receiver tuned to divine frequency. They told him of his destiny, of the great Waak he would lead, of how all orcs everywhere would unite under his banner and drown the galaxy in green. His fellow Goths dismissed this as the ramblings of brain damage. But Gazkul began to grow. Within months, he stood a head taller than he had before. Within a year, he had killed his way to leading his own warband. Within a decade, he ruled Urk itself, having crushed or absorbed every rival war boss on the barren planet. And all the while, he preached his vision of the Great Waak, the final crusade that would unite every orc under a single purpose. He was prophet and warlord, visionary and savage. And the Waak. Energy flowed through him like lightning through a conductor. Gazkul's first great campaign targeted the hive world of Armageddon, a planet of strategic and symbolic importance to the Imperium. It was heavily industrialized, its manufacturers producing war material for entire sectors, its strategic location making it a linchpin in Imperial defenses. Gazkul studied it, planned his assault, gathered his forces. This alone was unusual. Orcs did not typically plan. They attacked when the mood struck them, when the Waak energy reached critical mass and demanded release. But Gazkul was different. He understood patience, at least by orc standards. The first war for Armageddon began with Gazkul's fleet crashing through the planet's orbital defenses like a meteor storm. Orc ships were crude, barely space-worthy constructions of scrap metal and salvaged Imperial hulls, but they numbered in the thousands. They rammed Navy vessels, boarded them with mobs of screaming greenskins, overwhelmed them through sheer weight of bodies. The void battles lasted weeks. The space around Armageddon choked with debris and corpses. When the orcs made planetfall, they did so in numbers that defied counting. Drop pods and landing craft and shuttles crashed into hive cities and ash wastes alike, spilling green tides across battlefields that stretched to the horizon. Gazkul led from the front, his custom mega armor making him a walking tank, his power claw capable of tearing through plasteel bulkheads. He fought with the joy typical of his kind. But beneath that joy was calculation, strategic awareness of the larger battle beyond his immediate surroundings. The Imperial response was led by Commissar Yerrick, a man who would become legend. Yerrick was old even then, his body more augment than flesh, his remaining organic eye burning with hatred for the Xenos filth desecrating Imperial soil. He organized the defense with iron discipline, executing cowards and incompetents, inspiring the Imperial Guard through sheer force of will. He studied the orcs, learned their patterns, anticipated their movements. He became the anvil against which the green tide broke again and again. The two commanders recognized each other across the battlefield. Predator acknowledging predator. Ghazghkull spoke of Yarrick with something approaching respect, calling him a worthy enemy, lamenting that humans were so fragile and short-lived because this old man gave such good fights. Yarrick spoke of Ghazghkull only with cold pragmatism, recognizing that the orc warlord was more dangerous than any greenskin had right to be, that he represented an existential threat to Imperial holdings across multiple sectors. The first war for Armageddon lasted years before Ghazghkull withdrew, not because he was defeated, but because he grew bored. The fighting had reached a stalemate. The Imperium unable to dislodge the orcs from conquered territories, but managing to hold key strategic positions. To human logic, this meant victory was still possible through attrition and eventual counteroffensive. To orc logic, it meant the fight had become stale. Ghazghkull led his forces off-world, seeking new battles, new challenges, leaving behind enough greenskins to keep Armageddon contested for decades to come. The Imperium claimed victory. They rebuilt their defenses, reinforced the garrison, declared the Xenos threat contained. They were wrong. Ghazghkull returned for the second war for Armageddon 50 years later, larger than before, commanding forces that dwarfed his first invasion. This time he brought other war bosses with him, legendary figures who had sworn allegiance to his vision. Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub of the Bad Moons, whose wealth and teeth allowed him to field the best-equipped mobs in orc society. Uglehard the Decimator, whose Gargant mobs had crushed entire Imperial army groups. Dozens of others, each commanding billions of orcs, all united under Ghazghkull's banner. The Second War was apocalyptic in scope. Entire continents became battlefields. Hive cities burned or fell to orc occupation. The ash wastes, already toxic and lifeless, became mass graves for millions. Yarrick, now ancient beyond human norms and sustained more by augmetics and hatred than biology, led the defense again. Space Marine chapters deployed in force. The Salamanders, the Blood Angels, the Ultramarines. Their warriors cutting through orc mobs with chainblade and bolter. The fighting reached a crescendo when Ghazghkull and Yarrick finally met face to face in single combat. The duel lasted hours. War boss and commissar trading blows that would have killed lesser beings instantly. Ghazghkull's power claw snapped Yarrick's banner in half and crushed his power fist. Yarrick's storm bolter punched holes through Ghazghkull's mega armor, drawing green blood that steamed in the toxic air. They fought across ruined industrial sectors through collapsed tab blocks, their battle becoming legend even as it occurred. Neither killed the other. The duel ended when strategic concerns pulled them apart, other battles demanding their attention. But something had changed between them. They were no longer simply enemies. They were rivals locked in a pattern of conflict that defined them both. Ghazghkull told his boys that when he finally led the Great Wyack across the galaxy, he would bring Yarrick with him, captured and caged, so the old man could witness the triumph of the orc race. Yarrick swore that he would hunt Ghazghkull to the edge of the galaxy and beyond, that he would see the orc warlord dead, even if it cost him his last breath. The Second War for Armageddon ended, as the first had inconclusively. Ghazghkull withdrew again his Wyack. Intact, his reputation enhanced. He had fought the Imperium's finest and survived. He had besieged one of their most important worlds twice and remained undefeated. His name became whispered in dread across Imperial space, and other orcs heard those whispers and felt the pull of his Wyack. Growing stronger, other legendary war bosses carved their names into history during this golden age of orc expansion. Wazdaka Gutsmech, the legendary speed freak whose bike was said to have circumnavigated the galaxy, who led his Wyack in endless motion, never stopping, always racing toward the next battle. His philosophy was simple. If you moved fast enough, nothing could catch you. And speed itself became a form of invincibility. His red-painted war bikes screamed across worlds like mechanical locusts, leaving devastation in their wake. The Red Wayak of Urgok the Unstoppable crashed through the Maelstrom Zone, where reality thinned and chaos corruption ran thick. Urgok claimed to have fought demons and found them wanting to have raided demon worlds and returned with loot that glowed with unnatural light. His orcs were touched by the warp in ways that made them dangerous even to other greenskins, their weapons wreathed in strange energies, their eyes reflecting colors that should not exist. Nazdreg himself led countless campaigns, his wealth allowing him to hire freebooter fleets and field equipment that other war bosses could only dream of. His Flash gets carried the finest guns. His mech boys built the most impressive war machines. His personal mega armor was so covered in gold and decoration that it served as much to display wealth as provide protection. Each war boss commanded their own way of warfare, their own interpretation of the eternal orc drive toward violence. The Goths favored brutal close combat and looked down on excessive shooting as cowardly. The evil sons painted everything red and worshipped speed above all else. The Bad Moons flaunted their wealth and fielded the most flash gits and heavy weapons. The Death Skulls looted everything not nailed down and believed that stolen equipment worked better than equipment you made yourself. The Blood Axes studied enemy tactics and actually used camouflage, which other orcs considered almost treasonous. But beneath the clan differences, the core remained the same. Fight, grow strong, fight again. The war was eternal, a cycle without beginning or end. A war boss would rise, gather his forces, lead them to glorious battle, and eventually die. His death would scatter his forces, his mobs returning to tribal warfare or seeking new leaders. And from the spores his body released, new orcs would bloom, growing and fighting until one among them rose to greatness and began the cycle anew. The Imperium fought them on 10,000 worlds and could not stop them. Every Imperial victory was temporary. Every cleansed world was one spore away from reinfection. The orcs were written into the galaxy's fundamental nature, a constant that could be managed but never eliminated. They were the background noise of eternal war, the baseline level of violence that made everything else possible. And Gazkul's vision of the Great Wayak grew closer to reality with each passing year. He gathered war bosses under his banner, not through conquest, but through shared purpose. He preached unity, the idea that all orcs everywhere should stop fighting each other and focus on the galaxy's real enemies. This was heretical by orc standards. Infighting was as natural as breathing. But the prophet of Gork and Mork spoke with such conviction, grew to such massive size, won such impossible victories that even the most stubborn war bosses began to listen. The Third War for Armageddon erupted in the final years of the 41st millennium. And this time, Gazkul brought everything. Billions of orcs descended on the hive world, more than had ever been seen in a single location since the War of the Beast. The fighting was beyond comprehension. Entire armies vanishing in single engagements. Hives falling in hours. The death toll climbing into the hundreds of millions. Yerick was there again, impossibly ancient. His hatred the only thing keeping his augmented body functional. The war consumed Armageddon completely. It burned for decades, becoming a wound in imperial space that drew forces from across the segmentum. And then, at what should have been the moment of final victory, Gazkul disappeared. He left Armageddon mid-battle, taking his best warriors with him, abandoning the fight when it was at its most intense. The remaining orcs fought on leaderless, but no less dangerous. Gazkul's trail went cold. The Imperium did not understand. Victory had been within his grasp. Why abandon it? The answer was simple. Though the Imperium would not learn it for years, Gazkul had heard the call of the Great Rift. The galaxy had torn itself open, and from that wound poured Wayak. Energy on a scale that had not existed since the war in heaven. The psychic storm drew him like a moth to flame, and he followed it, gathering more and more orcs as he traveled. His Wayak, growing with every system he passed through. He was building the final crusade, the green tide that would drown the galaxy entirely. And the Imperium, beset on all sides by threats it could barely comprehend, had no way to stop him. The galaxy was an ecosystem, and the orcs were its apex predator. They did not dominate through superiority of technology or the elegance of their civilizations. They dominated through adaptability, through their ability to thrive in any environment against any enemy, under any conditions. Where other species required supply lines and reinforcements and careful strategic planning, the orcs simply fought, and in fighting created everything they needed. They were parasites and conquerors both, feeding on conflict itself, transforming every battlefield into a garden where their spores would bloom for generations. Every major faction in the galaxy had learned to hate them for different reasons. The war in Octarius had begun as an inquisitorial gambit and become a nightmare that threatened the entire eastern fringe. Hive Fleet Leviathan, one of the largest Tyranid tendril fleets ever recorded, crashed into orc-held space with the inevitability of celestial mechanics. The Tyranids were a galactic plague, a swarm of bioengineered horrors that consumed all biomass in their path and incorporated useful genetic material into new organisms. They had devoured entire sectors, stripped worlds down to lifeless rock, turned thriving civilizations into protein soup that fed the hive ships. The orcs met them with enthusiasm that bordered on joy. Finally, an enemy that would never stop fighting, that could not be reasoned with or intimidated or exhausted. The Tyranids did not retreat, did not surrender, did not suffer from morale problems. They simply attacked endlessly in numbers that rivaled the orcs' own. It was the perfect war, and the orcs threw themselves into it with religious fervor. The battlefields of Octarius became abattoirs on a planetary scale. Orc mobs charged into Tyranid swarms, chain axes screaming, shooters blazing, their battle cries drowned by the chittering of a billion alien throats. Gargants traded fire with biotitans, whose weapons were organs rather than machines, acid and plasma, and stranger things melting through armor plating. The ground itself became a carpet of corpses, orc and Tyranid bodies piled meters deep, the dead feeding the soil and the spores and the reclamation pools where Tyranid organisms dissolved their prey into genetic paste. Both species evolved in real time, adapting to each other with terrifying speed. The Tyranids consumed orc biomass and birthed new organisms. Hormagaunts with thicker armor to resist orc bullets, carnifexes with reinforced skulls to withstand power claws, lictors that could track greenskins through the psychic signature of the Wyak field. The hive mind learned that orcs grew stronger through combat. So, it developed organisms specifically designed to kill quickly to prevent enemies from gaining size and experience. The orcs, for their part, grew larger and more cunning than they had in generations. Fighting Tyranids was dangerous in ways that fighting humans or Eldari was not. A human who lost an arm could be neutralized. A Tyranid who lost an arm would sprout toxic barbs from the stump and keep fighting. The orcs adapted, their pain boys developing crude but effective methods of cauterizing wounds before Tyranid toxins could spread. Their mech boys building flommers that burned hot enough to sterilize bioforms before they could regenerate. The war bosses leading the Octarius campaign grew to sizes not seen since the beast. Some stood 4 m tall, their muscles swollen with Wyak energy, their cunning sharpened by constant warfare against an enemy that never gave them time to rest. They coordinated multiple mob assaults, timed their attacks to exploit weaknesses in Tyranid swarm patterns, actually preserved forces for future engagements. Instead of throwing everything into immediate combat, they were becoming more like the ancient Krork with every passing year. And the Imperium watched in mounting horror as the war spread beyond the Octarius sector. Orc spores and Tyranid organisms escaped on debris and refugee ships, seeding neighboring systems with contamination. Worlds found themselves facing dual Xenos threats, Green Tide and Purple Swarm descending simultaneously. The Inquisition's attempt to solve 2 problems had instead created a third. A hybrid plague of hyper-evolved killers that threatened to consume the entire eastern fringe. Containment became impossible. The best the Imperium could hope for was delay, pushing the contamination zone back system by system, knowing that complete eradication was beyond their capability. In the galactic northwest, The orcs crashed against the expanding Tau Empire with results that confounded the young species. The Tau were relative newcomers to galactic affairs, a civilization that believed in the greater good, in diplomacy and integration, and the gradual absorption of other species into their imperial project. They had successfully incorporated human worlds, Krut mercenaries, even limited numbers of other Xenos into their empire. They approached the orcs with the same confidence, sending diplomatic delegations to negotiate trade agreements or non-aggression pacts. The orcs killed the diplomats and looted their ships. This baffled the Tau leadership. Every other species they had encountered responded to incentives, to the promise of technology or protection or philosophical enlightenment. The orcs responded only to violence. They could not be reasoned with because they did not operate on reason. They could not be bribed because they valued only strength and the opportunity for a good fight. They could not be converted to the greater good because they already had their own philosophy, and it involved hitting things until they stopped moving. The Tau adapted their strategy, deploying hunter cadres and crisis battle suits to engage orc raiders. The fire-cast warriors fought with precision and coordination that should have overwhelmed the crude greenskins. They used superior range and mobility, striking from unexpected angles with plasma and missile fire before retreating beyond the orcs' effective weapon range. They employed textbook combined arms tactics, supporting infantry with armor and air support, creating overlapping fields of fire that should have annihilated any enemy foolish enough to advance. The orcs advanced anyway, laughing as their mobs took horrific casualties, closing the distance through sheer momentum. And when they reached melee range, the Tau learned what terror meant. Crisis suits designed for range combat were torn apart by power claws. Fire warriors trained for disciplined volleys were overwhelmed by greenskins who shrugged off pulse rifle fire and kept coming. The Tau fell back in good order, preserved their forces, followed doctrine perfectly. And the orcs pursued, because pursuit was fun and killing fleeing enemies was easier than killing ones who stood and fought. The Tau Empire's expansion slowed considerably on its eastern border, halted by a green wall that could not be negotiated with or outmaneuvered. Commander Farsight, the legendary Tau warrior who would eventually break from the Empire and form his own enclave, learned to fight orcs through bitter experience. He recognized that standard Tau doctrine was insufficient against an enemy that actively sought close combat and could not be demoralized. He developed new tactics, minefields and kill zones, fortified positions designed to channel orc advances into overlapping fire lanes, rapid redeployment to avoid being pinned by orc mobs that could overwhelm any static position through sheer numbers. But even Farsight understood that fighting orcs was different from defeating them. You could win every battle and still lose the war because the spores ensured that every victory was temporary. In the eye of terror, where reality collapsed into madness and the ruinous powers held dominion, even the orcs found purchase. Chaos was anathema to most life, its corruption turning organisms into twisted mockeries of themselves, breaking minds, and warping flesh into obscene configurations. The orcs, with their simple psychic gestalt and genetic resistance to mutation, proved surprisingly resilient. They raided demon worlds for loot, fought possessed Chaos Space Marines for fun, and generally treated the realm of the Chaos Gods as just another battlefield. Some orcs fell to chaos, their simple minds unable to resist when demonic corruption was applied with sufficient force. These corrupted orcs were abominations, their green flesh marked with symbols that burned with unnatural light, their weapons screaming with demonic voices, their bodies host to entities that should not exist in real space. They fought with strength enhanced by warp stuff, hit harder, and moved faster than any orc naturally could. But they were rare outcasts shunned by other greenskins who recognized instinctively that these corrupted kin had broken some fundamental law of orc existence. The uncorrupted orcs killed them when encountered not out of moral outrage, but because they were wrong, unnatural, not proper orcs anymore. The bulk of orc chaos interaction consisted of raids and counter-raids. Greenskin warbands attacking chaos-held worlds to steal weapons and test themselves against the traitor legions. The Chaos Marines found these attacks irritating rather than threatening. The orcs too disorganized to pose existential danger, but persistent enough to be a constant nuisance. Coronate warbands sometimes welcomed orc attacks, seeing them as opportunities for worthy bloodshed. Nurgle cultists found the orcs' resilience amusing. Sench sorcerers were frustrated by the greenskins' psychic simplicity, which made them nearly impossible to manipulate. Only Slaanesh seemed to have no purchase on the orcs at all. Their simple psychology, incapable of the excess and sensation seeking that the Dark Prince demanded. The Necrons, ancient and undying, faced the orcs with cold calculation and mounting frustration. The Necrons had slept for 60 million years in stasis crypts beneath dead worlds, waiting for the galaxy to grow quiet enough for their return. They woke to find it infested with lesser species, organic vermin that had to be cleansed before the Necron dynasties could reclaim their rightful dominion. They expected to sweep these upstarts aside with the same ease they had crushed organic life during the war in heaven. The orcs proved more difficult than anticipated. Necron warriors were nearly indestructible. Their living metal bodies capable of self-repair. Their Gauss weapons able to strip matter at the molecular level. They advanced in perfect phalanxes, emotionless and precise. Their programming unchanged since the epoch when they had been Necronter flesh. They should have been the perfect counter to orc mobs. Discipline against chaos. Precision against crude violence. But the orcs did not care about perfection or precision. They cared about hitting things. Necron warriors found themselves swarmed by greenskins who tore at them with power claws and chain weapons, prying apart living metal through brute force. Gauss flayers disintegrated orc mobs, but the mobs kept coming, and for every orc killed, spores were released that would become future warriors. Necron immortals and Lichguard engaged knobs and meganobs in close combat that should have favored the undying machines, only to discover that orcs grew stronger the longer a fight lasted. The Necron overlords observed this with processes that approximated frustration. They had fought the orcs' ancestors during the war in heaven, had faced the Krork and found them formidable, but ultimately defeatable through superior technology and strategic patience. These modern orcs were degraded, stupid, barely capable of coherent thought. They should have been trivial to exterminate. Yet they persisted. And worse, they looted Necron technology. Orc mech boys examined captured Necron weapons with their instinctive understanding of technology and pronounced them pretty good for shiny gubbins. They tore Gauss flayers apart and rebuilt them according to orc logic, creating hybrid weapons that should not function but did. Powered by belief as much as physics, they draped themselves in living metal torn from Necron warriors, wearing it as crude armor that somehow interfaced with their biology. They found tesseract labyrinths, those dimensional prisons where shardades and fragments were kept, and cracked them open to see what was inside, releasing entities of star-burning power that proceeded to devastate everything in the region before being contained again. The Necrons implemented scorched earth protocols on orc-infested tomb worlds, atmospheric cleansing, and molecular disintegration, fields designed to sterilize the surface down to bedrock. It bought them time, but not victory. The spores survived in deep caverns, in underground aquifers, in fissures that the Necron scans missed. Within decades, the orcs returned, and the cycle began anew. But it was the Eldari who understood the true horror of the orcs most completely. The craft world Eldari, refugees from the Fall, who lived aboard massive world ships and tried desperately to preserve their dying culture, had fought greenskins for millions of years. They had watched the Krork degrade into orcs, had witnessed the gradual erosion of sophistication into savagery. They knew the orcs better than any other species, had studied their biology and psychology and psychic resonance with the obsessive detail that came from facing an eternal enemy. And they knew the orcs could not be defeated, only delayed. Eldari farcers gazed into possible futures and saw green tides in every timeline. They saw craft worlds overrun, maiden worlds consumed, exodite colonies burned to ash. They saw orcs growing larger and more cunning with each generation of warfare, evolving back toward the Krork template through the pressure of constant conflict. And they saw no future where the orcs were absent, no timeline where the greenskin plague was finally eradicated. The orcs were eternal because they were simple, and simplicity could not be destroyed. Eldari aspect warriors struck orc warbands with hit-and-run tactics perfected over millennia. Their shuriken catapults and power weapons cutting through greenskin mobs with terrible efficiency. They killed war bosses before WAFs could form, assassinated big mechs before they could build gargants, destroyed spore towers before they could seed new worlds. They fought with grace and precision, every movement economical, every shot placed with lethal accuracy. And the orcs laughed and came back for more. Because killing orcs fed the spores. Because fighting them made them stronger. Because every Eldari victory was paid for in time and lives and resources that the dying Eldari species could not afford to spend. While the orcs simply regenerated from their own corpses and returned to the fight refreshed and enthusiastic. Some craft worlds attempted diplomatic solutions, trying to redirect orc WAFs toward other enemies, manipulating greenskin war bosses through carefully planted intelligence or false trails that suggested better fights elsewhere. This worked occasionally, briefly, until the orcs grew bored with their new enemy and returned to raiding Eldari holdings. Because, as one war boss put it, dark pointy ears are always good for a scrap. The Exodites, those Eldari who had rejected the decadence that led to the fall and now lived pastoral lives on primitive worlds, suffered particularly under orc raids. Their dragon mounts and psychic communion with world spirits could repel small incursions. But when a full whack descended, their only option was to flee into the webway and abandon worlds that had been tended for thousands of years. They returned later to find those worlds transformed into orc strongholds. Their forests burned, their sacred groves desecrated, the soil itself corrupted with greenskin spores. The Eldari mourned what they lost. The orcs did not understand there was anything to mourn. To the greenskins, the galaxy was a playground, and every species they encountered was either an enemy to fight or a source of loot to steal. They did not hate the Eldari or the Tau or the Imperium or any other faction. Hatred required investment, emotional energy directed toward a specific target. The orcs simply fought whoever was in front of them. And when those enemies were dead or fled, they moved on to the next fight without dwelling on the previous one. This made them more terrifying than chaos, more implacable than tyrannids, more eternal than necrons. Chaos could be resisted through faith and mental discipline. Tyrannids could be starved or redirected. Necrons could be avoided by not disturbing their tomb worlds. But the orcs were everywhere on every inhabited world and countless uninhabited ones, spreading through the galaxy like spores on the wind, impossible to avoid and impossible to destroy. They were the background radiation of galactic warfare, the baseline level of violence that made everything else possible. The Imperium fielded entire armies dedicated to nothing but orc suppression. Crusades that lasted centuries, whole sectors where the primary military objective was keeping greenskin populations below the threshold where they could threaten larger imperial holdings. Trillions of guardsmen died fighting orcs across 10,000 years. Their bodies fed into a meat grinder that produced no lasting victory, only temporary containment. And still the orcs spread because containment was not enough. One missed spore, one crashed ship, one greenskin survivor crawling into a cave to die and release his fungal payload. And within a generation, the problem returned, larger than before. The galaxy had become an orc garden, carefully tended through constant warfare, blooming in violence, wherever the fighting grew thick enough to feed the spores. Every faction contributed to this garden without meaning to. Their wars and conflicts creating the perfect environment for greenskin proliferation. The Imperium's eternal crusades, the Necrons' awakening, the Tyrannid invasions, the Chaos incursions, all of it fed the orcs, made them stronger, gave them more enemies to fight and more opportunities to grow. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, the orcs had already won. Not through conquest or dominion, but through existence itself. They would outlast every empire, survive every apocalypse, endure past the final days when the last star burned out and the universe fell into entropy. Because they were designed to thrive in war, and war was the only constant the galaxy could provide. The green tide rose and fell with the rhythm of conflict, eternal as the stars, unkillable as faith, simple and perfect, and absolutely terrifyingly unstoppable. The galaxy tore itself open in the final years of the 41st millennium, and from that wound, madness poured forth. The great rift erupted across the stars like a suppurating gash in reality itself, splitting the Imperium in half and bathing entire sectors in the raw stuff of the warp. Demons walked on planets that had never known chaos corruption. Entire star systems vanished into the immaterium, their populations consumed by horrors that had no names in human languages. The Imperium reeled, its million worlds suddenly severed from Terra. Half its territory plunged into darkness and isolation, and the orcs felt the rift open like a psychic thunderclap that resonated in every green skull across the galaxy. The Wyack, energy that had always connected them, that low-level psychic gestalt binding orc to orc across light years, a void suddenly intensified. Weird boys who had lived their entire lives managing tolerable levels of psychic pressure found themselves racked with visions, their heads filled with images of war on a scale that dwarfed anything they had witnessed. Some exploded, their skulls unable to contain the pressure. Others channeled the energy into devastating psychic attacks, immolating entire Imperial regiments with green lightning that should not exist outside the warp. The Great Rift was a wound in reality, but to the orcs it was an invitation. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka felt the call like the voice of Gork and Mork speaking directly into his soul. He had grown impossibly large in the decades since abandoning Armageddon, his body swollen with Wyack, energy drawn from the billions of orcs who followed his vision. He stood taller than Astartes' dreadnoughts, his custom mega armor reinforced and rebuilt dozens of times to accommodate his expanding frame. The adamantium plate in his skull, that crude surgery performed by Mad Doke Grotznik so many years ago, now crackled with psychic discharge, arcs of green energy playing across its surface whenever he spoke prophecy. He told his mobs that the time had come, that the great Wyack he had been building toward was finally at hand. The rift was a sign from the gods, a cosmic battlefield opened specifically for the orcs to prove themselves worthy. He gathered his forces, sending summons across entire sectors. His reputation and psychic presence drawing war bosses like iron to a magnet. They came in their thousands, each commanding their own Wyack, each bringing billions of boys eager for the greatest fight the galaxy had ever seen. The fleet Gazkul assembled eclipsed anything the orcs had fielded since the War of the Beast. Ramshackle kill cruisers and looted Imperial battleships numbered in the tens of thousands, their holds packed with greenskins and their decks bristling with weapons that violated every principle of physics. Space hulks the size of hive cities drifted into formation, their interiors home to entire orc civilizations that had never set foot on a planet. Rocks, hollowed-out asteroids fitted with engines and guns, tumbled through the void like green meteors awaiting their chance to crash into enemy fortifications. The psychic pressure of so many orcs gathered in one location created a presence in the warp that could be felt from Terra itself. Navigators reported seeing a massive green stain spreading across the immaterium, a psychic tumor that pulsed with aggressive intent. Astropads went mad trying to read the emanations, their minds overwhelmed by the simple brutal thoughts of billions of orcs, all thinking the same thing. Fight, kill, conquer, prove yourself the strongest. The Gestalt consciousness was approaching coherence, becoming something more organized than it had been in millennia. The Imperium, already bleeding from 1,000 wounds, watched this gathering with mounting dread. Gazkul's Wyack moved toward the Great Rift like a predator stalking wounded prey, absorbing smaller orc forces as it went. War bosses who had carved out their own petty empires looked at what Gazkul had built and bent the knee, swearing allegiance to the prophet of Gork and Mork. Their mobs integrated seamlessly into the larger horde, the psychic gestalt binding them together with shared purpose. This was unprecedented in modern orc history. Unity without constant infighting. Cooperation without immediate violence. The Great Rift had changed something fundamental in the orc psyche. Or perhaps it had simply amplified what was always there, waiting for enough war to wake it. The Greenskins were evolving not physically, but organizationally, remembering instincts from the Krork era when they had fought as coordinated armies rather than enthusiastic mobs. The Imperium's response came in the form of the Indomitus Crusade, Robot Guilliman's massive reconquest effort. The returned Primarch, resurrected from stasis by alien intervention, and Belisarius Call's technological sorcery, led fleets of Primaris space marines across the Imperium Nihilus, that dark half of the galaxy cut off by the rift. He brought hope and reinforcements to beleaguered worlds. His strategic genius and transhuman charisma rallying forces that had been on the edge of collapse. He was the Imperium's answer to its darkest hour. A demigod returned to save his father's dying empire. And even he could not stop the green tide. Guilliman's forces encountered Ghazghkull's Wyack. In the Nachmund Gauntlet, that narrow corridor of relatively stable space that connected the two halves of the sundered Imperium. The battles were apocalyptic. Fleet engagements on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy. Millions dying in void battles that raged for months. Primaris Marines, taller and stronger than their firstborn brothers, wielded weapons designed by Call himself and backed by the full resources of reconstituted Forge worlds. They should have overwhelmed the orcs through superior technology and tactical coordination. The orcs matched them ship for ship, warrior for warrior, their belief making their crude weapons as effective as imperial artifice. Guilliman himself studied reports of the Greenskin forces with growing concern. These orcs fought with discipline, maintained formation, coordinated their attacks across multiple battlefronts. Their war bosses communicated with each other, shared intelligence, actually retreated when tactical situations demanded it. This was not the behavior of mindless savages. This was the behavior of an army. The Primarch consulted his archives, read ancient accounts from the War of the Beast, and understood what he faced. The orcs were regressing toward their original form, the psychic pressure of the Great Rift, accelerating an evolution that normally took millennia. If left unchecked, if Ghazghkull's Wyack grew large enough and fought long enough, the Imperium could be facing Krork again, those 3M warriors who had fought the Necrons and Tan and nearly won. The implications were existential. The Imperium could not afford another War of the Beast. Not now. Not when it was already torn in half and besieged on every front. Guilliman ordered Ghazghkull's death to be a strategic priority equal to any Chaos incursion or Tyranid hive fleet. Assassin temples received contracts with blank checks. Death Watch kill teams were deployed with the singular mission of eliminating the Orc warlord. Entire chapters were tasked with hunting down and destroying his command structure. The Imperium threw everything it had at the problem, knowing that Ghazghkull was the linchpin holding the massive Wyack. Together, that his death would fragment the Greenskin forces and buy precious time. But Ghazghkull proved frustratingly difficult to kill. He survived orbital bombardment by being elsewhere when the shells landed. He escaped assassination attempts through a combination of orc cunning and the intervention of his Nob bodyguard. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural sense for danger. The psychic gestalt warning him when threats approached, and he continued to grow, his body expanding, his mind sharpening, his connection to the Wyack field deepening with every battle. Some Imperial xenobiologists theorized that Ghazghkull was undergoing the same transformation that had created the Prime Orcs during the War of the Beast. That given enough time and enough warfare, he would reach that same size and intelligence, becoming something that could speak Gothic fluently and plan campaigns with the sophistication of an Imperial Lord Commander. The thought kept the High Lords awake in their fortified chambers on Terra, knowing that somewhere in the void, an orc was evolving into something that could threaten the Imperium's very existence. And then Commissar Yerrick died, and Ghazghkull's response shook the galaxy. Yerrick the hero, Yerrick the unbreakable. The ancient warrior who had fought the beast of Armageddon 3 times and survived finally succumbed to wounds sustained in battle against chaos forces. His death was not dramatic, not cinematic. He simply bled out on some forgotten battlefield. His augmented body finally unable to continue. His hatred finally exhausted. The Imperium mourned a legend. The orcs barely noticed except for one. Ghazghkull, when he learned of Yarick's death, fell silent for 3 days. His mobs grew nervous, unused to seeing their war boss motionless. When he finally spoke, he declared that Yarick had been the greatest enemy he had ever faced, the only human who had truly understood how to fight orcs. He ordered a funeral procession, an orc ritual of remembrance, and had Yarick's body retrieved from Imperial custody through means that remain classified. He kept the commissar's corpse in a stasis field aboard his flagship, claiming that when the Great Wyack finally conquered the galaxy, Yarick would be there to witness it, even in death. The gesture was bizarre, touching, horrifying. It revealed depths to orc psychology that the Imperium had never fully appreciated. Ghazghkull was not simply a war boss or a prophet. He was something more, something that could form genuine bonds, even with enemies, that could recognize worth and respect it even across the gulf of species and ideology. He was becoming a person, not just a force of nature, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. In the regions touched by the Great Rift, orc activity reached levels that defied all predictive models. Wives erupted from systems that had been pacified for centuries. Greenskins boiling out of the ground in numbers that suggested impossible spore saturation. Worlds reported sightings of orcs that stood taller than any recorded outside the War of the Beast. Massive greenskins wearing sophisticated armor and wielding weapons that approached the quality of ancient Krork artifice. The genetic regression was accelerating, fed by constant warfare and amplified by warp energy bleeding through the rift. On the demon world of Vigilus, where the Imperium had established a massive fortification to guard the Nachmund Gauntlet, orc forces besieged Imperial defenders alongside Chaos warbands in a 3-way conflict that consumed entire hive cities. The fighting was so intense, so prolonged that the orcs there grew noticeably larger over the course of months rather than years. Imperial commanders watched with sick fascination as enemy war bosses swelled from 2M to 3, their tactics evolving in real time as their intelligence increased. And then there were the discoveries, the excavations that revealed truths the Imperium wished had remained buried. On dead worlds in the galactic core, Mechanicus explorator fleets found ruins that predated human civilization by millions of years. Structures built on a scale that dwarfed Imperial architecture, made from materials that resisted all attempts at analysis. And in those ruins, they found armor, massive powered armor, 3M tall and sophisticated beyond anything the orcs should be capable of producing. The armor was covered in glyphs that resembled orc tribal markings, but more refined, more purposeful. The Mechanicus studied these relics and understood with cold horror what they represented. This was Krork armor, preserved across eons, proof that the ancient warrior race had been far more advanced than their degraded descendants. The armor incorporated technologies that the Mechanicus could barely understand. Force field generators that operated on principles unknown to Imperial science. Power sources that had remained active for millions of years. Neural interfaces that suggested psychic integration between warrior and equipment. Some suits were recovered intact and brought to Mars for study, kept under maximum security, and sealed behind wards that would trigger planetary extinction protocols if breached. The Fabricator General looked at these relics and issued orders that they were never to be publicly acknowledged. If the Imperium citizens learned that orcs had once been sophisticated enough to produce such technology, if they understood that greenskins were slowly evolving back toward that template, the psychological damage would be catastrophic. Better to let humanity believe the orcs were mindless savages, an annoyance rather than an existential threat. But the truth could not be suppressed indefinitely, and some Mechanicus factions began secret projects attempting to understand Krork technology. They examined the armor's construction, tried to reverse engineer its systems, sought to comprehend the fusion of organic and mechanical that made it function. All attempts failed. The technology required orcs to operate required that psychic gestalt and genetic understanding that no amount of human study could replicate. It was locked to a species designed by minds so alien that their work remained impenetrable even after millions of years. The message was clear. The Krork had been a civilization, not just an army, and fragments of that civilization still existed, waiting to be found. In the closing years of the 41st millennium and the opening decades of the 42nd, the Imperium faced the reality it had always denied. The orcs could not be defeated. They could be fought, contained, temporarily pushed back, but never eliminated. Every imperial victory was Pyrrhic. Every cleansed world one spore away from reinfection. The greenskins were written into the galaxy's genetic code by the Old Ones. A curse that would outlast every empire and every species. They were eternal because they were simple, and simplicity could not be destroyed. Ghazghkull's great Wyack continued to gather strength, drawing orcs from across the galaxy like a black hole drawing matter. His fleet grew until it could be tracked from Terra through purely psychic means. A green stain in the warp that moved with terrible purpose. Imperial prognosticators tried to predict his target and failed. The future clouded by the psychic pressure of billions of orcs, all thinking violent thoughts simultaneously. Some believed he would strike at Terra itself, finishing what the beast had started. Others thought he would plunge into the Eye of Terror, seeking worthy enemies among the traitor legions. A few suggested he would turn toward the Tyranid hive fleets, drawn to the greatest concentrations of violence in the galaxy. All predictions were wrong because they assumed Ghazghkull thought like a human planned with human logic. He did not. He followed the Wyack, that psychic current that flowed through all orcs, trusting Gork and Mork to guide him to the greatest fights. His path was unpredictable because it was not planned, not calculated. It simply was moment to moment, battle to battle. The Imperium could only react, only respond to where he appeared next, always one step behind, always arriving after the damage was done. In Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy cut off by the rift, orc Wyafs raged across systems that had not seen Imperial reinforcement in decades. Isolated worlds fought alone, their defenders knowing that no help was coming, that they would stand or fall by their own strength. Some held through faith and stubbornness and the Emperor's blessing. Others fell, consumed by green tides that transformed them into orc strongholds within a generation. And from those strongholds, new war bosses emerged, leading their own Wyafs, the cycle perpetuating itself endlessly. The orcs had become the galaxy's constant, the baseline level of violence against which all other threats were measured. They were there before the Imperium rose, and they would be there after it fell. They had outlasted the Eldari Empire, would outlast the Necron dynasties, would outlast the Tyranid hive fleets and the Chaos gods themselves because they required nothing but war to survive, and war was the one thing the universe would never run out of. The spores drifted through the void, patient as entropy, carried on stellar winds to dead worlds and living ones, to forge worlds and agri worlds, to shrine worlds and cardinal worlds, and every classification of planet the Imperium had named. They settled in ice caps and jungles, in deserts and oceans, in the ruins of civilizations, and the foundations of cities not yet built. They lay dormant for decades or centuries, waiting for conditions to become favorable. And when they bloomed, they brought war with them, because war was what they were made for. The galaxy had become an orc garden, tended through violence, flourishing in conflict, eternal and unkillable. Every faction that fought contributed to this garden without meaning to. Their wars feeding the spores, their battles creating the perfect conditions for greenskin proliferation. The Imperium's crusades, the Necrons' awakening, the Tyranid invasions, the Chaos incursions, all of it served the orcs in the end. Because the orcs were not trying to conquer the galaxy, they were already part of it, woven into its fabric at the genetic level, as fundamental as gravity and as permanent as vacuum. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. And where there was war, there were orcs, laughing in the face of death, growing stronger through violence, reproducing from their own corpses, believing with absolute certainty that they were the strongest, the best, the chosen of Gork and Mork. They were crude and brutal and simple. And in that simplicity lay their immortality. The Imperium would crumble eventually, its institutions collapsing under the weight of their own corruption, its faith unable to sustain an empire spread too thin across too many stars. The Eldari would fade, the last of their kind dying in defense of craft worlds that would become tombs. The Necrons would return to sleep, waiting for a galaxy that would never grow quiet enough for their peace. The Tyranids would consume everything in their path and move on to the next galaxy, their hunger eternal, but their presence temporary. And the Orcs would remain, fighting whatever was left, adapting to whatever enemies survived, thriving in the ruins of every fallen empire. They were the galaxy's end point, the final answer to the question of what survives when everything else has burned. Not the strongest or the smartest or the most noble, but the simplest, the most adaptable, the most fundamentally aligned with the universe's essential nature. The spores drifted, landing, taking root, blooming into warriors who knew only joy in violence and purpose in war. The green tide rose and fell with the rhythm of galactic conflict. Eternal as the stars, unkillable as faith, simple and perfect, and absolutely terrifyingly unstoppable. In the end, when the last human died and the last Eldari faded and the last Necron returned to sleep, when the galaxy fell silent and dark and cold, the Orcs would still be there fighting each other, laughing, growing from spores, living their simple truth. There was only war, and war was